Hi everyone. In this podcast style episode, my sister Bea and I discuss the astrological elements, fire, earth, air, and water, via their mythological and astrological meanings. And if you want to hear what next follows, which is the sun archetype, you can already find it at our podcast site via the web link or through any podcast app on your phone. You can find all of these links in the description of this post.
Welcome to Archetypes and the Planets, where Andre Kahr and I, Bea Gonzalez, invite you to think metaphorically as we explore how we have collectively translated the map of the sky into our mythologies, religious systems, and personal psychology. So, Andre, we finished our tour of the planets, and I thought before we started our tour of the signs, we would discuss something that I find is often overlooked in astrology, which are the elements. So the elements being fire, water, earth, air, that are we're all composed. Our planets are in these different elements, and we're sort of composed of sometimes equal parts, sometimes very unbalanced parts. And I started noticing that it really linked very well to Jung's typological system, which is what got me interested, and even more now to the work of neuroanatomist Jo Bolte-Taylor and her 4 parts of the brain. So I thought we could start talking about it. So first of all, do you, in your practice, pay much attention to the elements, or is this something that doesn't call out to you as much?
I definitely do, because you get primary characteristics from the elements that, in a way, supersede the entire panorama. Because when you're looking at planets and signs, you would say that's a level down in a way, and you see this so frequently. This is what I read that Jung had tuned into, even though he wasn't doing actual astrology. He noticed in his practice that the number of people that would walk in the room to do relationship something or other seemed to be linked to the elements a lot more than you would think would be statistically relevant. Right. And you see this a lot. You see, people that are the same sign, or the same sun, but the same element. In other words, Capricorn, Virgo, and Taurus, or Libra, Gemini, Aquarius, and then projecting from that into a person's basic nature. And this is where we can talk now about the elements and what they mean. And this is where you could have a chart of a person that will say, well, I read my Taurus meanings, and they don't seem to connect with me, and maybe they have a lot of planets in Gemini, or maybe in Aries or somewhere else. And that explains it, because then that element is more dominant.
Right. That's what I see as well. So let's go back to the beginning and then work our way through the elements. I think the Hellenistic astrologers, who codified kind of this, got it from the pre-Socratics, and specifically Empedocles. He's the first one that we know divided into 4, air, water, fire. And then you had this other concept, which was the idea of love and strife. And I think love belongs more to that feminine qualities, the 2 that are considered feminine, which is water and earth, and then the other 2 are more the masculine. And people shouldn't think of love, strife belong to the masculine, and people should understand that strife doesn't mean war, and it means separation, and you need to separate things to understand them, because love kind of mushes all together. So both are needed, but they're both, if you want to put them in 2 categories of yin and yang, then you would put the water and the earth in the yin, and the fire and the air in the yang, which is much more active principle, much more moving forward, which I think the other 2 are much more receptive. So that's, I think, where it all began. And, of course, Jung was a great reader of philosophy, so he probably understood these. So Jung did do a lot of, did use a lot of astrology. The book that Liz Green did, she did a couple on this. She had access to his archives. So let's just work through our way through the elements. Let's start with fire, because that's the spring starts with Aries, which is fire. So how would we talk about fire?
Energy. Fire people, for example, they love burning energy. They like going on trips and hikes and canoes and water rapids. I mean, you think of the skiing sometimes. sports connects to fire as well, if a person is fond of burning energy. And then the associated qualities, enthusiasm, radiance, and you put it in the, you're putting it in the, the idea of plus, positive, masculine, but not meaning positive good in this case, just it's the idea that it's an outward flowing energy. So then you also associate the qualities on the downside where you might get excessive ego, excessive even narcissism, and that the person is so fond of their energy they imagine that everything channels through them, and so then they become less sensitive to other people, which is that idea that you mentioned around water and earth tending to be more receptive, and in that sense fire and air are projecting the energy outward more, right? And it's also, when you think of fire and air, they support each other, for example. So then, because air is in the chart, in any zodiac, air is going to be in trines that are in the aspects that are 3, 6, 9, so sextiles, right? So you're supporting. It makes sense. Fire, if you use air, it'll burn more brightly. If you throw water on fire, that wouldn't work at all. Neither does earth. So these categories are pretty solid. But yeah, fire I associate with those qualities, and you notice that they show up in the fire signs: Aries, Leo, Sagittarius. Right. Yeah.
I would probably add performance to fire. I find that there's again, because you want to be out on stage, right? The idea of exploration, performance. There seems to be a natural ability to be comfortable in an area where maybe the water signs wouldn't be so comfortable. It's an expression, just self-expression being very important, which is one component of creativity. But I kind of disagree with people that think that it is all creativity. It's just one aspect of creativity, which is much more on the stage as opposed to on the page, shall we say. So then the next one on our list would be the first, it's just going in the sort of the order of the zodiac, would be Earth. Which is a feminine negative, but of course negative not in the way that the word is usually used, but receptive, like much more receptive energy. So what is that? What is Earth to you? What kind of things come up with Earth?
Practicality, security. The notion with Earth is a sense, and you could almost say survival, not in the same way as the watery survival, which is more emotional. We can get to that later, but the idea of practical approaches to things, and almost asking the question, Earth will always ask, if they hear an intellectual argument, okay, that's a really interesting argument, but what's it for? What's it going to do? What does it accomplish? Because it wants to know, are you building something with that? Are you creating something that is going to be used by anybody? Structures, sure, because if you think about it, anything, a structure necessarily is made of Earth. Now, not scientists, will quarrel with this. This is where astrology in the Middle Ages, the divergence happened when what scientists did in a way is they drill down. They drill down and they say, well, you can't say Earth because Earth is really atoms that are, many different elements and so forth. And in a way, they're dividing it so much that you lose track of the original concept, right? The original sense of what it means. But when you look at anything anywhere that exists as a structure, including your own body, it's primarily built of Earth. But of course, a scientist can then say, well, yeah, but your body is 60-something% water. That's true. However, where are you going to put that water if you don't have the container?
It's a container, absolutely.
To put it in, right.
Of course. And so that's why it does actually rule something like, if you think of all the body parts that Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn, which are the 3 earth signs, are associated with. I mean, Capricorn is basically the skeletal structure. It's actually the whole thing holding it up, right? So absolutely. So, and because we're going to tie it to the Jung typological system, we would say that in the typological system Jung devised, fire is intuition and Earth is sensation.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah, exactly. Which, by the way, this is where you would then, as an example, tie some of the teachings that are out there. There's an elemental quality in Zen. Zen has a very earthy. In fact, Buddhism, you could argue that there's this sense that the Buddha may have been a Taurus.
Right.
And the Buddha's notion of enlightenment was he sits under a tree and he just waits for it, right?
Yes, that
To
is
him, he's
Taurian.
not. It's very Taurian, and also you're constantly counseled in Zen and in Buddhism, just be in your senses.
Right.
What do you see? What do you taste? What do you smell? But people can misunderstand that as well, because the idea is that you're fully in the senses.
Right.
You're not supposed to be indulging your senses. That's a totally separate activity, right? But yeah, that's the logic to that. And you'll come across in teachings where they'll say, if you follow any sense to the limit, you enter into transcendent states, right? That's another curious. There you go, in a sense, to the so-called fifth element, that the ancients talked about ether, where you enter this other dimension, and you're doing it by, in a sense, riding the elements.
Right. Right.
So in that sense, Earth is also very spiritual, but the general sense of Earth is practicality, life security, more consciousness of a person, say their bank account, security factor so that they can keep things rolling along in a practical way. That's
right,
the Earth.
Right. It's interesting. One of the theories of that I've read about the elements is that as you progress through each of the elements, so Aries would be the first fire, and then Leo would be the second, and Sagittarius, it's almost like the third in each of these schemes becomes the more developed version of fire, right? Or the more developed version, or the most kind of a quality of development that. So you take one thing, I'm thinking of Capricorn, and Capricorn has that quality of, you'd almost say that when you talked about being aware of the senses but not indulging, I can't think of a sign that less indulges than Capricorn, right? It's very it's very good at denial. It's like, no, I understand. No, totally. Even though Saturn rules Aquarius as well, it doesn't have that same connotation. I believe it's the earth quality to say discipline is so important that knowing how to say no becomes very important. And I think when you start with Taurus, I think saying no is harder for Taurus. But as you get through these elements, you could argue, and this is just one theory, it may be true or not. So then we get to water, which is next in the, air comes first before
Air,
water in
yes.
this scene. Right. So air is more mental, right? Tell me about air.
Yeah, more cerebral, in the sense that, for example, you see this quite frequently in air signs. They love the maps, and they love the theories, the paradigms they build, so much so that they then can just talk about the paradigm they're not necessarily relating to or practicing, let's say. So air signs can get tremendous joy out of just talking and discussing and making intellectual connections. But by the same logic, even just thinking of the natural zodiac, Gemini, Libra, Aquarius, they're very relational. That's the idea of two people, or even the idea of relationship itself too, because relationship is the notion of merging with something, or, in some sense. The true merging would be Scorpio, but just the idea of relating is automatically air as well. That's how
what's interesting about the air, which I don't think it does not apply to the rest of them, is that in air, you have two of the three signs are ruled by the same planet, which is Mercury, which is very much about the communication and being able to, and that's how you connect to people often,
yes.
Being able to share stories or ideas, or can just be the mere act of talking, but also Mercury being a translator from the unconscious to the conscious, making something that is unconscious real to other people, but through the vehicle of speech or writing or whatever.
Yes,
so it's interesting about that, but very, very much so. In Aquarius, I look at it, if you look at it as the third, so you look at all of them, then you go to Aquarius as the most detached of all three. When you get to Aquarius, you get a feeling of complete, the Aquarian archetype sees things holistically to such a degree that sometimes they miss the parts, or the kind of the warmth, maybe because the polarity is the opposite is Leo, but I find it can sometimes lose contact with a human. When they get lost in that. I mean, this is obviously people have more than one planet, but in a place, but just as a general principle. Then we finish off, and of course, in the Jungian typological system, that would map the thinking type, which is what it's called. Yes. And by the way, the thinking type is probably the predominant type typologically, in that we have structured our whole world, and even more now than when Jung was writing, about around communication, around speech, around how much we value words and ideas. And the thinking mind is basically taken over the whole show. That would be the idea that I'll introduce later that came from the neuroanatomist. I thought was very interesting. All right, so we got the thinking, and then we finish with the last, which would be Cancer would begin it, which is the water, Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces. And what do we say about that element?
Emotions, emotional connection, feeling, that entire world of something that is very hard to pin down, the way water is as well, and yet it's very real. It's a sense that you feel your way through things rather than think through things.
Right.
Feeling is become super important. So, and you see this in Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces in different ways, but nevertheless. That's the logic of that. Right. So it's, I think
of Pisces as the third in that. And what's interesting, even in the iconography, is that the symbol. You have Cancer, which has a hard shell, and then you got a Scorpio that has a shell of some sort. But then you get to Pisces, and I think Pisceans have the biggest problem as an archetype with boundary laying. They really don't know how to establish, how to put, because you're trying to put a wall in the middle of an ocean, and it's too difficult. Whereas the other two at least have some protection. They know that they don't really want to be merging with everything. But I think that archetype of Pisces being the third in that set can be a bit problematic in that regard. On the one hand, it's very beautiful, it's compassionate, but on the other hand, if the person does not have strong Saturn, I find that can be a problem, with merging maybe with too much. And in the Jung typological system, of course, that is the feeling function, which is, I have to say, probably the most misunderstood of all of the functions in the Jung typological system, because people think it's about emotion, and it has nothing to do with emotion. It has everything to do with differentiation of feeling. In other words, a strong water person, a strong feeling person, when they feel anger, they understand that it's actually a consequence of sadness. Maybe they're able to distill what's really working underneath the surface without mushing it all together. An air person will come up with a story. An earth person will get busy and build something so they don't have to think about it. A fire person will just start a new project or, start singing or something to avoid it. But a real feeling person should be able to understand what's operating, what's happened, what precipitated this. And so to a certain degree, Jung thought that was the one that the people had the biggest problem grasping, because the mind had become, their thinking is opposite. So the mind had become so powerful that you could no longer really access the body enough inside the emotional turmoil that was going in there and be able to say, oh, this is what it really is. This isn't what I think it is. And I thought that was interesting because, again, it is the problem with water is, and I would think some people can do this better than others, is that it is kind of a big glob, right? So you have to be really skilled to go in there and say, okay, this is what's really happening here. And people who are very in touch with their emotions are able to do that, I think, quite skillfully. So he called it a valuing function, just like thinking. It's a function of assessment, of being able to understand, whereas the other two he called irrational. They were not that. That was air and fire are completely different. No, sorry, not air and fire. Then we go to sensation and intuition, which he saw.
Fire and earth. Fire and earth are the ones.
Yes, fire and earth. He did not see in that kind of category. He actually saw them more as, that they're not valuing functions. They're a different type of approach. But regardless, and so he divided them differently in that regard. The two that would be opposite each other. Although, if you think about it, earth and fire, as you said, are not exactly things that understand each other all that well. I mean, they're not. They don't have that relational capacity that something in sextile would, where they can discuss each other. So one of the things that I find really interesting, I don't know if you've noticed this, is that if you add up your elemental mixes, Jung had a theory that the answer to every problem would come from your inferior function, which means the thing you're weakest at. So imagine a stool with 4 legs, right? You're missing the fourth leg. It is by going to that part of yourself that feels really uncomfortable. So let's say you're a thinking type. It is by going to that feeling type, to your body, to try to figure out and cut the mind, that actually gives you the response. So he thought and it's all over our fairy tales, by the way. Marie-Louise von Franz did a lot of work on this, where he said this keeps showing up, that the answer comes from the the third brother who's riding the donkey backwards, who's going in the wrong direction, but who somehow wins the princess. So she said, "Well, what? Yeah, but what could that mean, right? I mean, you have to ask the question
backwards."
And that's how you find it. Yes. So why? And he said, because that it's by using the part of yourself that you feel more uncomfortable with that the genius comes through. Because the other part is habituated. If you think about it, this is one thing you're taught a lot in meditation, et cetera, that we're always working on our habitual patterns. So you almost need a lightning strike to come through. And it's not going to come from the things that come easy to you. It'll be the thing that comes that's a bit difficult, that feels foreign, right? But kind of exciting because, wow, I've never danced before. Or I've never thought of thinking my way through this problem. I always just, emoted through it. So that's an interesting thing, because I don't know if you've noticed this, but I've noticed in my own chart, and I've noticed in people's charts that I've looked at, that it is actually true that they tend to overdo sometimes their least prominent, element. Like air. Air for me is a good example. I'm surrounded by books, so I spend my life reading, and yet air is one of the least. I only have one planet in the air. That's an important one, but it doesn't matter. The point is that it's a very weak element if you're going to add it up, right? But yet I keep going to it. I keep overcompensating. It's almost like you're driven. Like, What do you think of that notion?
I know 100%. Yeah, I think you and I share this because we both have a single planet in air in Aquarius, and I've been asked by people, you must have a lot of air because of all the ideas. Although you have to be careful with it in the sense that planets have a nature that can, as you put it earlier, Mercury. If a person has a very strong Mercury in any sign, anywhere, that Mercury will, in a sense, take over the air faculty. And so my own Mercury is in Earth, but yet it's super active. So then I think it adds to the air.
Yeah.
And yet if you don't bring that argument in and just say, okay, well, look at the elements. Yes, one single position. And yet, yes, it has a lot of effect because it almost feels like that's how, for example, you could explain it as it feels like the person consciously or unconsciously is seeking to balance themselves by exploring the area that feels like it's there, but it's not as accessible. So then there's a lot of digging that goes on in order to bring it to the surface and so forth. So yes, that's a full agreement. And this is why sometimes a person will say, well, how do you explain that I'm quite practical and my affairs are in order, let's say in quotes, and I only have one planet in Earth? That's precisely why, because they're always going there. And so life works like that. If you're always focused on something, it tends to progress.
Right. Yes. No. I've seen that drivenness, and then I look and I think, what? Even sometimes absent anything. Like I've seen people with absent of Earth, but they're really obsessed with order, and I'm wondering if it is a way to calm, or if they're going naturally to that missing leg in order to solve a problem that they see within. And sometimes they don't. Another thing I have noticed is there are two things that you could be sometimes people who are abundant in the element that you are missing in can be either very irritating to you or very attractive or very appealing. It's almost like they're living out a part of you that you can't quite grasp. So they either draw you to them or they actually repel you. Like I have found that very heavy air people can tire me out to no end. I feel at the end of it, I think, okay, enough, go away. And it's not their fault, obviously. It is my own inability to, like, the way they're conceptualizing on an ongoing basis and not maybe sometimes connected to other parts of them. I'm talking about really super heavy air people, by the way, not someone with a couple of, but I found that my reaction is it drains me. It's like, no, there's too much air. I have no contact with what's really going on in your body, in your mind, in your feeling state.
Yeah.
Certainly your mind, but nothing else. Do you find that to be the case a bit or not?
No, absolutely. In fact, I think you can even add to that it's often why the same elements form relationships, because there's a quality to the elements so that when the incompatible elements are around each other, there can be these problems that emerge, and they're almost inexplicable, but it just doesn't feel right somehow. There's a disconnect because of the clash of elements, unless other parts of the chart make up for it, right? And one of the things that you mentioned that I think is worth exploring a little bit around, why do some people know, for example, around sensation, around feelings, why are they able to figure out, oh yes, these are my feelings, and therefore I can understand why I'm feeling this way, and or separately, why does a person with a single element do particularly well in that particular realm of that element. There's where you probably have to go to something that within the elements is probably most associated with air. Often people refer to air as the human element, and you notice that even in the symbols, they're the most human symbols, because you find a lot of animals everywhere else. But there you go to the notion that, in a sense, supersedes everything. It's the idea of awareness, self-awareness. You think awareness emerges from air in a certain sense, and then the person can put things in context and understand, oh yes, these are my sensations. Something in them is aware of what is going on, and that will help them to express their chart better, in contrast to, say, the caricatures that you might find where a person is less aware, has an element missing, and they act it out. They act out the fact that it's missing, or altogether, where they're not growing in that sense. They're just doing too much of the other ones, as you would expect from a lack of awareness. Right. So, but there probably air is the one that is most likely to be helpful, to reach those points.
I find it interesting that, for example, I just looked at artists' work, and I became obsessed with what kind of songs artists were singing, and did they match their elements. And I often found that it was a bit of a missing element business again as well, that it often seemed that the people who were, say, missing water were very attracted to these heavy emotional songs. And I'm thinking, okay, this is how they're working out their inferior function, for example. And I think you can apply that to writers. Any kind of creative artist is probably trying to connect to that part of themselves that feels weaker. Again, going back to that in fiction, but it's still very, very compelling. And that is why I think they're attracted to other people that have that. Or at times, I think, when you look at the principle of projection, I think that's where a lot of people demonize other people. They think, well, these people are all this. And it's like, you look and you're thinking, okay, they're the people expressing something you are incapable of expressing. Yes, and that can produce admiration, or it can produce resentment, depending on what type of person you are personally, right? So I find that really, really super interesting. So the other thing I've noted is that there is I don't know if have you heard of Jill Bolte Taylor? She did this thing called My Stroke of Insight. She had one of the most, most watched TED Talks, because she was a neuroanatomist who had a stroke when she was 36, and part of her brain went offline, and she barely survived it, because what happened is she had her left brain basically went offline. And so she started connecting to everything, which is what the right brain does. And she was like, oh, this is wonderful. But she had enough of a brain left to know, if I don't get help, I'm going to die here. And then she went through 6 weeks of being in that state where her left brain was totally not there. And she recounted it in this fascinating book called My Stroke of Insight, and the talk that anybody can find. I think it's been watched 28 million times. And she's a great advocate for what she calls whole brain living. And she's just written a book where she divides the brain into 4 parts. And those 4 parts, she said, are actually very similar to the Jungian typological system, which of course is very similar to the elements, right? Yeah. And her argument, which I thought was brilliant, is that brain number 1 matches to the thinking. And that is the most dominant by far. It's just so dominant that really that's the first one you look at. Okay. Number 2 would match to, and she has this idea that you should give it a name. Everybody has these 4 parts. So let's say your number 1 is the one that gets organizes, understands things. You give it whatever name, you might want to give it. You associate with an organizer and somebody who can get things together. Number 2 is the one that carries all the memories. I associate this with feeling. Every time they do anything, they're referencing back to something else, which might make them feel distraught, but they are carrying the memories. You need that to a certain degree. So you give that a name. And then on the other side, number 3, sensation, she actually links it to the person that's active and doing something in the here and now. And, the builder, the carpenter, who's completely lost in that moment and not worried about the present or the past. And number 4 is intuition, and she calls that the connecting one, because that one sees possibilities everywhere. This is fire, right? It doesn't see you. It sees all the possibilities that you can be. Now, her view is, if you're overworking one of these parts of the brain, right, then you need to ask the other parts what's going on. And and I thought it was a very brilliant model, because she said, if you name these and you know enough about the elements or the typological system to be able to understand them, then when you get into a muddle, the idea is not to go to the part that is always like the thinking, oh, I figured it out. To say the thinking is not getting me anywhere. What does number 2 say for me to do? Oh, memories, this connects to this. What does number 3 say? I should get active on this in this particular way. I should be building this. I should be, making a meal, whatever. And number 4 connects you to the larger story, to what is this really about in a larger way that has nothing to do with mind, its possibility, its connection, whatever. And I thought, wow, what a great way. And she calls it whole brain living. And what she's trying to tell people is that because we overwork the thinking brain, the human part, as you say, because we've had 2,500 years of overworking that to death, right? What's happened is we've basically atrophied all other parts. Now, I would think that if you look at a chart, right, it's going to depend. Some people are going to be very naturally able to go into the feeling side and connect to the memories and connect to the larger picture emotionally, and others aren't. I mean, I don't know what you make of this. What do you think of her model, the way she's put it together?
No, it sounds like a good model. Like a lot of these models will, in a sense, resemble each other and point to the elements. And there may be some incompatibilities, but it's going to make a lot of sense because you can't invent. You can't come up with something that is completely different than what humans are experiencing. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And this is too where it's a little bit like when people talk about the I remember in high school, well, is light a particle or is light a wave? Well, it's a wave and a particle. Yeah. So the elements, they blend into each other. And if you say, for instance, air is the element that thinks, but it's also the element that, in a sense, is connected to awareness as you get beyond thinking, then you could say it's fire that does that. But you could just as easily say maybe the person feels something through their water energy. And then, in a sense, what you're doing is you're connecting everything together. Right. And that's mysterious. And probably fire is the most likely to do the connection, but it doesn't do it by itself. It does it because the other elements are there as well. And this is where it's very hard many times for a person trying to understand these categories. And you put things in boxes, pretty soon you lose the whole thread. Yeah. So whatever you want to call it, whatever that mysterious thing in you is that is able to coalesce things, yes, it's probably fire, I would say, the intuitive. Puts it all together, but even that requires the other elements, right? You can't get away from the fact that fire by itself is just fire. It's burning energy. And,
I wouldn't say that fire is the connector. I think they all connect in different ways.
They all connect in different ways, right?
So they're just doing, I think fire has the ability to perhaps have, the way they understand it anyway, to have a glimpse of the future, of possibility, whereas feeling would be much more beholden to the past, which if you think about emotion, think about feeling, it is actually beholden to the past. You're replaying the script.
By the way, you can see this in astrology. On the caricature side, fire, well, Sagittarius, for instance, the ninth sign is very future oriented. The idea of exploration, what can we, how do we expand this? But Cancer, which is the primordial water, in a sense, the first water sign, the most personal, they tend to be people that are, look at our ex-president, you hoard things, you hold on to the past. You're always reminding yourself of how this thing that happened somehow makes you. And so Cancer individuals often have trouble letting go of the house they live in because of all their memories, again, the moon, the past, right? So you see these patterns through the elements as well, as you just put it. Cancer, Scorpio. Scorpio would be, the caricature of Scorpio is the emotion of something that happened in a relationship and the inability to forgive.
Revenge.
Transgression. So you get, it's like, I will kill you for doing that type thing. So you see this in caricatures, but it also, explains how the elements work.
Yeah. I mean, by exaggerating something, I remember Kalman talking about when you have an emotion, feel it in your body and exaggerate it to an extreme and then let go, because then you know what part of your body is clenched. And I thought that was such a brilliant observation. So by exaggerating the qualities of some of these signs and the elements, et cetera, I think you get a caricature, but you actually get the quality that can be expressed on many different levels and intensities. So I think of, like, if you want to continue the caricature, you get to Pisces, and that's where the victim becomes like, oh, everything is, because they give so much, and then they turn into the victim, the perpetual victim, that something is being done to me. But no, it's like you are not establishing proper boundaries. because that's where connection really is so valued, that it's overvalued.
No,
But then,
that's totally true. With when you are so open that this is the biblical that line in the Bible that says, "Be gentle as a dove and wise as a snake," because in the world, if you are too open, people take advantage of you. It's just the way it is, and then that's the idea of you create a boundary, which Pisces doesn't have any boundaries, right?
No.
So you need an earth equality for boundaries. Earth, especially Saturn, no, don't cross through there.
Right.
And by the way, there are plenty of Pisces people that have very good boundaries, and there will be Taurus people or Capricorn people with very poor boundaries because of the way maybe there's Pisces there, or maybe there's a disconnect on the water element and so forth. So this is where that astrology is very rich and can become incredibly complicated if you don't look at everything that is there in the chart. Yeah.
Right. And so the idea really here is to just talk about one aspect of it. And of course, then there's so much modification you do with a particular chart. There's no question. But in terms of understanding why you're driven to interpret the world, let's talk about what lens are you interpreting the world by? It's a very different thing if you're interpreting through the air lens and sit down and rationalize your way through an issue than if you're interpreting it through, let's say, water, where you're basically feeling the issue and getting lost in your memories and getting lost and by the way, both of them can solve a problem, and both of them are very lousy at solving a problem. It depends on the problem. So Joe Bolte Taylor's idea is you need both. You need to say, okay, how do I first do it? You need four of them, actually. You need the four brains. You need, okay, first I work through it there. And she said most problems get unresolved because people get stuck. And they can only see it in that way, and they can understand it. And also, by the way, I would argue that if you are living with people, and I think this is why I keep seeing elemental matches with people that have long-term relationships, I don't think you can work with people. You can have a livable situation if you're that mismatched, because you will constantly grate on each other's nerves to some degree. You'll have to be finding a way, around the fact that they are seeing it, or unless you work a lot on yourself. If you work a lot on yourself, then you're able to do that distillation process and then say, oh, okay, that person is going to see the world through the air lens, so I have to understand it. But in general, I find it interesting that a lot of the relationships I know are kind of elementally matched in some way. And it may be that the living situation becomes a lot easier, right? It's not fraught with misunderstandings. So in terms of the inferior function, though, and how we work with that missing leg, I guess this is what you would do in a consult, right? Because someone may come to you and you see that they have a lot of water, and you probably tell them, hey, listen, you need to bring in Saturn in here to do a little bit of work on your behalf. And talk to me about how, if in an actual, because of course you're a consulting astrologer, I am not, in an actual situation like that, what would generally be your, I mean, of course, it's going to depend. So this is speaking in generalities, but what would be some of the solutions for each one of the elements? Let me go one by one. So someone has a real lack of fire. How do you get the fire going in the person's chart when they what would you do? What are some of the things you would look at to get it going?
Well, fire. You mean if they're lacking fire, or they're not connected?
If they're lacking fire.
Right. So fire, energy. So this is where you remember that Jonah Hill movie where I think he's probably an Aries. That's my feeling about that Stutz character.
Okay.
Right, and he says to him in a very primary way, he says, just raise your life energy, increase your energy. This will tend to immediately do something for you in terms of feeling better, which, by the way, now feeling better sounds more like a water factor in a person's makeup. And yet he's saying, look, if you just raise energy, that's a major step in terms of realizing what's happening, being able to do things and so forth. So that's typically the fire advice, so to speak. And then the notion that fire is a kind of enthusiasm, a sense of feeling the life force. And as soon as a person feels energy, they typically know what to do. They'll be interested in whatever they're interested in, and they'll do it. And it also links to the idea of intuition as to what the next step might be. So that's the logic with fire. And I would probably say I tilt that way as a general connection with people anyway, because I happen to have a lot of fire. So that happens to be my filter. And it's possible that, yes, it's true that if I I'm working with a person that says all water, hypothetically, right?
Right.
It might be a little bit tricky because they might say, "What is all this fire energy? What are you talking about?" So that's just to say that, in a way, you could argue that it may be that water is very important when counseling in terms of the receptivity. Water and earth, let's say, sense what is there before you speak or before you say anything. Right. Otherwise, in a way, it's your message. Even if it's a good message, it may not align well with that person. But anyway, back to the beginning. Fire.
There's fire, yeah.
Energy.
Okay, just get it going. So what about earth? So a person comes, they have no earth, they're impractical, they can't organize their lives, they're having issues. How do you get earth online? What do you tell them?
Earth, obviously practicality, but earth is a, shifting again to this thing of the Zen view of life is Zen is very Saturnian in a way. It has this quality of, what are you doing with your time? But they're not telling you, Zen people don't say, well, you should be making lists and organizing your time. No, they're saying, be in the moment, be present to your life. That's a very earthy way to be. And when you're present to what you're doing, again, it can solve a lot of problems because you will get insight into that, which is an air, usually faculty, or you'll feel the enthusiasm sometimes to move forward and so forth. So it's the idea of being where you are. That's an earthy quality. So that would be the connection for earth.
Right. So now we move to air. The person comes to you, lots of water, lots of earth, no air anywhere, lots of fire perhaps, but there's the air is totally absent. What would you suggest as and now this is going to be difficult for you, maybe, or more difficult.
Yeah, right, because it's not my element. No, right,
but you looked at me and I thought, oh, he's thinking about this one a bit more.
Yeah, I'm thinking what I would say. Well, yeah. I think with air, well, in a way, in fact, I do this a lot. I'll say to people, one of my go-to phrases is I'll say, well, think about it, meaning think about this. So air is logic. In astrology, the word logical is inside astrology. So people should realize that there's a logic. Yeah. You try to put things together. And at the same time, you can think about something and it can ring a bell, so to speak. Oh, yes, okay, that makes sense. And at some point, you also want to realize that the thinking is what leads you to being aware of the thinker. Like the idea of awareness, which is above thinking, which in a sense supersedes itself, so to speak, right? So all those things kick in around why do people do things like meditation, forms of self-awareness. That's a brainy thing. It's something that you're doing. People always say, well, I can't meditate because my mind is like a monkey mind. All I notice is that I'm thinking. Well, the answer to that is you apply earth probably, and earth is the idea, I'm going to practice, I'm going to show up, I'm going to learn about this, I'm going to make it a task. And then you practice until you create a bit of a gap. Something in there realizes, oh yes, my mind is thinking. And then you question yourself, well, who's noticing that? That's the thinker, so to speak, the mysterious thing. How Pirvalaya used to say, one of his books is called That Which Transpires Behind That Which Appears. He had long sentences.
Yes, I remember.
But it's the logic of that, and that, in a sense, is still airy because it's a mind experience. It's a distinctly human experience. You cannot convince me. People will say, well, animals are more connected to life. Yes, they are, but they're connected in a kind of absorption, the way babies are connected. There's no overview. So then I've seen animals suffer as they start to get old because they don't know what the heck is happening. They're losing their connection. Right. So that's a distinctly human ability to both think and realize that they're thinking.
Right. I would like to interject here and note that we've talked about animals before and had quite the pushback on your YouTube channel when someone said, "Oh, I'm not going to listen to this anymore when they say animals are not like humans." And I think what you're making a very good point on is the thing that most distinguishes humans from animals is precisely the thinking capability, because to this moment we don't know of gophers who philosophize, and that's what makes us this is the very definition of the human and of air, because those are the signs that actually refer to thinking.
Yeah, and it's not supposed to be there's no good bad here. You can think of good things about anything and bad things about anything, including
Yeah.
all the human abuses. I'm aware of that. I'm
Oh,
only
of
pointing
course.
out,
Yeah, no, of course.
because if animals thought, I mean, think about this, right? If they actually thought the way humans think, they probably would have destroyed us long ago
Yeah,
because they would have figured
they
out
had good
we're not
cause.
taking this. Yeah, I mean, there are so many animals that would go, okay, enough of this. They'd go to school, and they would coalesce their knowledge, and pretty soon they'd have nuclear weapons or worse, whatever, right? Or they would just get
Yeah,
together and attack us.
stomp us. Yeah, absolutely. At some point, and then we would not blame them. Those who think about this a bit. Okay, so we talked about the fire. Now, how would water? Did we talk about water already? Or
No,
am I?
water's the last one, so no, we didn't. So
No,
what
okay,
was what?
so no, fire we haven't spoken about either. If somebody's lacking fire, oh no,
No,
we talked about
yeah,
fire. Sorry, Earth. Now I'm getting really confused. Help me out here. So we talked about lack of fire. We talked about lack of air. We talked lack of. Oh yeah, so it's only the only one that is left is water. So what do you
water.
do with a person
Well,
who?
water is interesting. My counsel always says, and I have a theory that the sign you are also is drawn to the opposite sign for obvious reasons, for polarity.
Yeah,
And one of the things around Capricorn, the caricature is Capricorn doesn't feel anything. There are people that disconnect from their feelings. And yet, I constantly say to people, for example, I say to people, if you want to learn astrology, you have to feel the planets. If you don't feel them, you are basically regurgitating someone else's explanation of the planet.
right,
You should be able to feel it and then know that's what Saturn feels like, that's what
right,
Uranus, that's what the moon, whatever. So, similarly, someone at the Council around Water, someone would say that might say, I'm not connected to that element, whatever the story is. Practice feeling, practice literally tuning in to how you feel about something. So there would be like a practice where let's say the person was really loaded with air, lots of thoughts. As you said earlier, behind that there's always a feeling. Why is there a memory in the first place? Almost always, the reason your brain stores a memory and not something else, because there could be this long tape of everything that's ever happened to you, and there are all these places with memories, and there's typically a feeling connected to it
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
entrenches it, right? So then being aware of that is really powerful because again, it helps you to understand how you are, what you're about, and so forth. So
This
that's what.
reminds me of a lot of the talks that Pema Chodron does and others like her who are always saying that really what causes the major problems are the fact that we have events that then link back to early events prior to the time that we had language. So we didn't know how to. And so you're almost going on, and this is a water idea. I think of fishing. You're going fishing for those original moments in time where something got trapped. Didn't have language for it. You didn't have an understanding. If you're 3 or 4, you have no idea what's going on. I actually just wrote a piece today that relates to a memory I had, a very early memory that then related to something later. And I thought, yeah, that's what you're doing. And often it's working so underneath the surface that to retrieve it is really quite difficult. It takes concerted effort. And of course, there are a whole bunch of people that don't even believe in this stuff, say, oh, that's nonsense. So why even go looking? But when you're working with modalities that try to help you with trauma, one of the things you're constantly doing is finding the original trauma. Go back to the original trauma, because if you can unwind that one, anything afterwards actually is helped along the way. It's almost like it's always going back to the resolution of something that happened so early on that you just couldn't do anything about it. So I think
Yeah.
that actually speaks very well to it. Okay, well, I think we covered all 4 of them. I do think they're very important, and I do think possibly because I read so much about Jung and he's central to the way I look at things, that he created this typological system that was then used by Myers-Briggs and adapted to many places. But actually, I think it's a really useful thing to be watching that in your own chart. And then, of course, through transits and progressions, things change, right? You can enter a period where you can actually morph, when I had my progressed ascendant through Aries, well, that actually allowed me to be a bit more fiery in different ways that I wasn't prior or after. So you go through moments when you can adapt, but it's something that I think people should pay more attention to in general, I think, when you're looking at a makeup of an entire chart. So I think this might give them some ways to look at it, which is what this whole thing is about.
One thing that I could mention, by the way, that just came to me now is that in the Sufi teachings, they have this practice where you breathe for a few minutes every day to balance the elements, so that in that particular explanation, when you breathe through your nose, in and out, that's earth.
Right.
When you breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, it's water.
Oh.
When you breathe in through your mouth and out through your nose is fire. And when you all mouth is air. And if you ponder this, I know it sounds a little strange, but it actually makes a lot of sense, because, for instance, when you're running, the tendency is to open your mouth.
Open your mouth.
Enough air.
Grasp, I guess.
Yeah, and I noticed, as an example, that something that's always puzzled me about the breath of fire, that is this yoga breath, where when you do it with really full force, you are effectively taking energy in through your mouth and putting it out through your nose, even though it appears that you're just using your nose. So now the idea would be that, for example, you could, if you felt that one of your elements was out of balance, then you could do that particular breath maybe a little longer. The standard practice is do all four to balance them all, but that's what tends to happen. That the idea would be to feel really, really good. You want them all to be as as equal as possible.
Well, there you left us as a good earth person with a practical thing to do, which is really good. Yeah, because generally, the theoretical is really not going to take us anywhere. But once you can do a practice, then things can change. So I love it. That's great. Awesome. Okay, until next time when we start discussing the actual signs one by one, which I think will be a lot of fun too. Okay. Thanks for listening today. If you want to hear more about all of this, go to YouTube, where you will find Andre's channel called Astrology Alert. He posts videos there almost daily. He also teaches classes through his Patreon account. You can find me at sophiacycles.com. If you want to support my work, I've recently released a new novel called Invocation, which you may find of interest. Go to my website to see a book trailer about it. It's available in all fine bookstores, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Finally, if you like this podcast, please rate it and leave a review so that others will find it as well.